Good evening, everyone. My name is Samantha Snyder, and I am the reference librarian here at the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at George Washington's Mount Vernon. I want to thank the Ford Motor Company for their generous support for our monthly book talks and continued commitment to promoting American heritage. I do want to mention some upcoming library programs, which include our annual Martha Washington Lecture on June 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which will pay tribute to the amazing career of Mary Wiseman, who is retiring after many years of portraying Lady Washington here at Mount Vernon. The event will also look at the broader field of character interpretation at historic sites. This event is free, so please sign up online through our website. And next, we have our very first live Ford Evening Book Talk for the first time since COVID began. On July 15th, author David O. Stewart will be here at Mount Vernon. He will be speaking about his new book, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. So now to introduce my dear friend and tonight's speaker, Dr. Lorri Glover. Lorri is the John Francis Bannon Endowed Chair in the Department of History at St. Louis University. She is here to talk about her new book, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, an independent woman in the age of Revolution. Dr. Glover worked on her book while she was here as a fellow at the Washington Library in the class of 2016-2017, and I am so happy to welcome her back here today. I only wish it could be in person. So without further ado, here is Dr. Lorri Glover. So, hi, Lorri.
Hi, Samantha. It's so nice to be with you, even though we can't be in person, but it's great to be at least this close.
Yes, exactly. And I just want to say, first off, I loved your book. It was wonderful, and I am excited for everyone to get a copy and read it themselves. But I want to go ahead and get started with our questions. So I do want to say, please feel free to drop questions in whatever social media platform you're watching on. I know I'm excited to get to talk with you about audience questions as well, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with some of mine. So I thought it might be good to offer the audience a background of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and her world. So I guess I want to first ask, who was Eliza Lucas Pinckney?
So at the end of researching the book, I decided that Eliza Lucas Pinckney was a kind of quintessential 18th century planter patriarch who also happened to be a woman. She was raised in the Caribbean island of Antigua in a slaveholding, sugar-producing family. She received an extensive education in London. Her family then relocated to colonial South Carolina. Her father shortly had to leave, and her mother fell ill. And so at age 17, Eliza Lucas took charge of 3 lowcountry plantations. And that began a decades-long career as an agricultural innovator, an entrepreneur, an international trader of rice first and then indigo, and she had experiments with silk and other things. She was a lifelong slaveholder. She lived through the Revolutionary War, and she died in Philadelphia during the Washington administration. So she was in some ways a contemporary of George Washington. They knew one another and visited, especially in the early 1790s. And she was like him, planter patriarch turned revolutionary and American.
Yes, and I saw a lot of similarities between her and George Washington as I was reading, so it's interesting that you bring that up. And since you kind of said when you were researching her, how did you begin your own journey with Eliza?
So my dissertation was about 18th century South Carolina. And anybody who's ever researched colonial South Carolina knows who Eliza Lucas Pinckney is. She's fairly famous in South Carolina today because of the work she did in her own life and the work that her descendants did in promoting her legacy. So I've known her a long, long time, but I started about 6 years ago working on this biography. There was a huge new digital project, similar to the Martha Washington Papers project that's ongoing out of Mount Vernon now. It was launched out of UVA, the Rotunda program, or funded by the Rotunda program. It was launched out of the University of South Carolina. And the project made accessible all of the writings of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who was the most prolific woman of the 18th century. If I mean by that, the person whose writings were preserved over time, and maybe other women wrote more, but no one has a huger collection of surviving materials from the 18th century, no woman, than Eliza Lucas Pinckney.
Yeah, it was wild to see how you talked about the different sources and things. And I was like, man, she had so much. And the way she seemed to write too, and the letter books that you talk about and that sort of stuff, it's fascinating to see women's writing habits and things. So that's really just excellent. And speaking of writing, I know that she, of course, traveled across the Atlantic several times. And I was really just intrigued by that, all the different places she went. So could you talk a little about her experiences moving through all these spaces over her lifetime? She was in America, Antigua,
Yeah, so she was born into this sugar-producing slaveholding family in Antigua, which is in the Leeward Islands. It's near Montserrat. When she was 10, her parents sent her to London for an education. So when you write a biography of someone, there are sort of moments like snapshots that you have in your head to, reflect on who the person was and what transformational events happened in their life. So she went from this tiny island in the Caribbean to the center of the English Empire. She had never felt temperatures below about 60 degrees. And from the age of 10 until 15 or so, she lived in England, getting a pretty extensive education. And then she sails back to her family's Caribbean home. And so I think about what that must have been like for her parents to send away a 10-year-old girl and then welcome home what, in the middle of the 18th century was a young woman. And what that must have felt like for her to go from the center of the empire to the far, far periphery. She wasn't in Antigua very long before her family relocated to South Carolina. So she made that trip. In the 1750s, she and her then husband traveled back to England. They lived there for several years and then back again. And so she was back and forth across the Atlantic a good number of times for a woman in that era. And she wrote about the later voyages, not the early voyages. There's nothing from her until she's about 17 or 18 years old. She begins to write about her life and her experiences in her first letter book, which is really a collection of letters to her father to explain how she was managing his, and then what she came to think of as her estates. So she was quite an Atlantic wayfarer.
That's a good way to describe it. That's a great way to describe her. And I was just the amount of things that happened in her life before she turned 20 was just amazing to me. Her life started off so powerful right away, and how you begin with the comet, that whole thing about, and she's 10, I think, when she writes that, or she's young. I know that she's young, but yeah, it's just fascinating, just her early life. And I mean, it is full of so many changes and such independence building. And I really liked your transition into her life with Charles and kind of how they became a couple and all the inner workings of that. But her whole transition into less of a planter patriarch on her own and more into the social world of Charleston Was she unique in kind of how she was in the social world and economic world as a plantation owner? Or were there other women like her?
So I wanted to know how unique she was when I started. And I wanted to know that the whole time I was researching and writing the book. And I finished, and it's been out, 6 or 8 months. And you probably think this with your own research and writing about Elizabeth Powell.
Mm-hmm.
I still don't know. I don't know how unusual she was versus how unusual she appears just in a historical record, right? So if there were scores of her contemporaries who had kept elaborate records of their thoughts about astronomy and botany and religion, would her view seem unusual, or is her atypicality rooted in the rarity of female created sources and preserved sources from the 18th century? So, I found in the records out of South Carolina, and then I know from your work in Philadelphia, I have a friend who is writing a biography of Elizabeth's sister, Mary Willingbird, in Virginia. So I know from other people's writings, as well as from snippets of evidence in colonial South Carolina, that there appear to be a good number of women who were highly educated, with capacious interest, independent-minded, financially independent, the managers of their own estates and businesses and families. But there's not nearly so much about them to be able to fully verify that the way that I was able to fully verify it over the 70-year life of Eliza Lucas Pinckney.
Yes. Yeah. And you're right. In these women, and I definitely deal with the same thing with my work on Elizabeth Powell. And I'm sure that Amy does too with Mary Willingbird. And that's fascinating to think about all those women whose voices have not survived in such depth as you have gotten to experience with Eliza, and that some other women have gotten to experience with writing biographies. But yeah, what a special woman, if not unique, just very special. So, just very interesting. But one thing I did notice in talking about her as a planter patriarch and stuff is that she relied so heavily on enslaved labor. Like that I know is not unique, but she just seemed to have very intense views on it. But how does that compare with other plantation holders? And it didn't seem to really waver throughout her life. So do you want to talk more on that?
Sure. So I never forgot in the writing of the book about a woman who, in many ways, I admired her. I thought she was ambitious and audacious and smart. And there were many things to admire about her. But there were many other things that were profoundly troubling and really revolting. The most significant, of course, was being a lifelong slaveholder. So I never forgot that. And in part, I never forgot it because she never forgot it. I mean, she was born in the 20s in the 720s in the Caribbean. But by the time she was a young woman, there were, of course, enslaved people who were challenging her mastery. There were evangelical Christians who were criticizing the institution of slavery. By her middle age, there were leaders within the revolutionary movement who were opposed to the institution of slavery. She spends her last months in Philadelphia, which is the site of the first white created anti-slavery institution in the West. And so there were plenty of challenges to the institution of slavery that she rejected. And she was, as she lay dying, tended to buy women she enslaved and forced to go with her to Philadelphia. I imagined that she, was sort of unrepentant about that. in death because she had been completely unrepentant about it in life. And, the cover of the book, which is behind you, is a beautiful silk dress. It was her dress. It was produced out of silk that was grown on one of her plantations by produced by enslaved children and enslaved adults. And so, the clothing she wore, the houses she lived in, the travels she was able to take, the education that she had, all of it was paid for with slave labor. And she never forgot that. And I tried never to forget that. And in that sense, in her refusal to ever reject slavery and abandon, her lifelong commitment to racial bondage, she was again very similar to many Southern planter patriarchs, including, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Patrick Henry. I mean, those men gave voice to the sort of moral hollowness of slavery. They accepted that it was antithetical to their values. The South Carolinians didn't have so many moral qualms as the Virginians did, but none of them engaged, well, with a few exceptions in Virginia, none of them engaged in widespread emancipatory projects.
Yeah. So interesting. And I really do want to say you do a fantastic job of really making sure that everyone understands the importance of enslaved labor in Eliza's life from start to finish. Throughout the book, I was like, this is so important, and she does so well with it. So, and I know we've been talking a little bit about the materials that survive, and we just mentioned the dress, but it seems like objects are so important for you to tell her story. And could you tell me a little more why that is, and why material culture seemed to play such a special part in Eliza's life?
Yeah, so when I started a long time ago as an historian, I didn't think very much about material culture. I mean, when I went to South Carolina to do the first professional, I guess, archival research I ever did, I just thought, I've got to get to the archives and read as many documents as I possibly can. And I was right there in Charleston, and I didn't think very much about the architecture, the layout of the city. I didn't go to the Charleston Museum. But over the next 20 years, I learned how essential material culture and artifacts are to really understanding any historical moment, and certainly any historical figure. So thankfully, besides preserving so many of Eliza's writings, her descendants preserved 2 of her dresses. One is in the Smithsonian, one is in the Charleston Museum. Her son, Charles Coase Pinckney, was one of the founders of the Charleston Museum. And that museum also owns a pair of her shoes, a brooch she owned, a silver tea set, the canopy from her bed, which was designed with indigo dye and designed to replicate indigo plants. That's a crop that she grew in South Carolina. I went to Antigua to see, where she grew up and see what the landscape was like. I was able to visit in London and in South Carolina and in Philadelphia, the places that she lived. And that became essential for me really understanding the world she inhabited and the values that she held to. So it was terribly important. And understanding the importance of artifacts and material culture and architecture and topography, I think, has been the most important lesson I have learned as an historian over the last 20 years.
I agree with you. I think material culture is so important, and I feel like that with my work too. And it is just amazing that you are able to see these tangible objects, and how cool that you went to Antigua. That's amazing. And what a way to weave yourself into her life and understand it at such a a deep level. And there is something really special about objects and spaces. But you did bring up her descendants, and I did want to ask, in the second half of your book, you kind of transitioned from talking about Eliza and Eliza's story through her eyes and the broader world around her, to using her children and grandchildren as kind of leading characters in the story. And could you tell me why you decided to feature them so prominently and kind of a little more about them? I know they led very interesting lives too.
Yeah, so there are really two main reasons why they factored so heavily into the story. Is that Eliza's life was very much centered on the future of her family. At first, it was the future of the Lucas family. She wanted to be a good steward of the responsibilities that her father had, placed on her in running their properties in South Carolina. She was married for 14 years to a man who was considerably older than her, and she was quite a young widow. But she was deeply in love with Charles Pinckney. And so, by the time she was 40 years old, her focus was no longer on the future of the Lucas family. It was on the future of the Pinckney family. And so the things that she did were, the investments that she made, the experiments that she engaged in, the financial transactions that she pursued, that was very much focused on the future of the family. And so it was of vital importance to her. And then secondly, she instilled in her three children, and they instilled in their children, the importance of honoring the family and of honoring her. They became a central part of her legacy. She was, in addition to being a planner patriarch, she was mostly a single mother raising three children. Her husband died when her sons were, I think 12 and 6, and her daughter was about 10. So she had a son, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who became an important statesman. She had a daughter, Harriet Pinckney Lorri, who became, like her mother, a planter. In the 1790 South Carolina census, she was the largest slaveholder in the state of South Carolina. And then the youngest son was Thomas Pinckney, also an important statesman. So they became the living manifestation of her focus on family. And they also became very prolific writers like her. And they made sure that she got written into the history of the state of South Carolina and of the young American Republic. So, for those reasons, both of what was available in the sources that they produced and how important a legacy was to her, they factor, they're central to the second half of the book in particular.
Yeah. They seem to live very interesting lives. And I think so much of that is, of course, Eliza as a mother, and her focus on them and preserving her legacy through them and their own legacy. It was really fascinating to read that part and be like, oh, this is really interesting how long of like these Pinckney descendants were so powerful in their own right. But speaking of the descendants again, they did write quite a lot about her. And I know that there's a couple of biographies from the 19th century, and you do use some of the stories from those, but you kind of are like, this might have happened, might not have happened, the way they say it. But how did you navigate unpacking those stories and finding the truth in them? And did you run into any struggles with that?
Yeah, so that's tough because the early biographies of Eliza Pinckney were written by descendants, and they're 19th century biographies. And so they're a blend of history, family stories, and primary sources, but heavily edited transcriptions of letters or entries in the letter book or prayers that she had written. And some of them, some of the episodes are apocryphal. Some of them are excessively celebratory. Some of them tell you more about the early 19th century or the late 19th century than they do about the 18th century life of Eliza. So I had to use them with great care, but there still were things within them that were really valuable, that could be verified with other sources from the period. So it required a good amount of, carefulness to figure out what you could use, what I could use, and what I couldn't use. But it was also very revealing to me of how important a figure she was in the family, and how important it became to her children, her grandchildren, and her grandchildren, and so on and so forth, to preserve her life, to preserve the material artifacts of her life, to integrate her into the story of South Carolina, and to preserve a record of her life. It was of vital importance to them, and I thought that was a reflection of what she had taught her children and her grandchildren.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those are interesting. The kind of those 19th century blending of those things. And yeah, I'm so glad that those existed, though, for you to kind of use and navigate. And I know that
it's kind of like when people, I was just going to say, it's kind of like when people use, George Washington Parke Custis wrote about his adoptive grandfather. And people can use those materials, but you have to use the same kind of, care. You can't just, can't use any source uncritically, but you have to be particularly careful about using memories who are invested in the story they're telling.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I do want to remind the audience, we're eager to hear some of your questions. So please feel free to drop it in any of the social media platforms you're using. But I do have a couple more questions for you. Or really one more question. What do you want people to take away from reading your book? What message do you want to send?
So I hope readers see the 18th century from the eyes of a woman. So much of the 18th century, when you think about 18th century America, you think about Jefferson and Washington. And when you think about the 18th century Atlantic world, you think about George III, Toussaint Louverture. And it's a very male-centered, it feels like a very male-centered world. Mm-hmm. But what I discovered in researching Eliza is that women were at the center of family life, which was much important for most people most of the time than politics. And women were often at the center of economic life. And women had different experiences and different perceptions, including of the American Revolution. So we often think about the American Revolution as this sort of unleashing of independence. We call it the War for American Independence. Well, Eliza Pinckney was independent for the Revolutionary War, and she was independent after the Revolutionary War. But during the war, the bottom fell out of her family finances. She was ruined. She was temporarily homeless. She had to move into the houses of friends and neighbors and relatives. And so it was an incredibly chaotic and destructive experience. And you know that from the paintings of, Washington crossing the Delaware, or the meeting at, the revolution all seems very masculine, but it also seems very rational and very romantic. And women who were often at the front lines of the war, who became refugees as a consequence of the Civil War that emerged in the South during the Revolution, had no such romance with the war. And so that's one example. There are others, but I would hope that readers would see something new and different about the 18th century by looking at it through Eliza's eyes.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And I hope they do too. And everyone should check this out. And it will just be, it's a fantastic read. And I do want to transition to audience questions. Tammy. Hi, Tammy. Tammy Manorino asks, how was Eliza Lucas Pinckney perceived by male planters of the same class? Did she have close friends among them? It's a great question.
So that is a fantastic question. And it's a really important ending how a planter patriarch. She upheld all the racial values of 18th century South Carolina. And in addition to being a very skilled planter patriarch, she was a very good socializer. She read the right books. She wore the right clothing. She knew how to speak French and play musical instruments. And so she fit right in with the gentry class of colonial South Carolina. If she had not fit those gender norms and if she had violated the racial norms, I think she would not have been so embraced by male planters of her class. But because she otherwise fit in, and she was very smart and she was very committed to agricultural innovations and entrepreneurship, quite successful. And so she fit in well and partnered with other planters, mostly men, in South Carolina in the 1740s and 1750s. She had a number of close male friends. One of her close friends was her future husband. She was very good friends with Charles Pinckney and the first Mrs. Pinckney. Her name was Eliza. She had good friends with him. They're, I think, 17, 18, 20 years older than her, something in that range. They took her under their wing. She traveled with them some. When the first Mrs. Pinckney, Elizabeth Pinckney, got sick, Eliza helped Charles Pinckney take care of her. And when she died, Eliza and Charles got engaged a month and they got married within about months. So that was one friendship that turned into a rather quick romance, but she had other friends as well among powerful figures in South Carolina, and during her widowhood was friends with several governors. But she was, perceived by them as very skilled, competent, trustworthy.
And I guess we can go on to our next audience question. I did also want to say, I'm so glad you brought up Charles Pinckney and their friendship. I thought that was really cool. And I know it was a little dramatic. Like, I know some people were kind of critical in the period, but I thought it was very sweet and a testament to kind of her social life and yeah. All right, here's another question. Would you talk about the significance of Pinckney's indigo cultivation and why did colonists like her want to grow it?
So the main crop in South Carolina in the 1730s and 40s and even in the 50s was rice. That was the principal commodity that was commercially used and trafficked around the Atlantic world. Eliza's father left South Carolina because he got called into military service in the Caribbean. That military service was a sort of a spiraling war. It had a couple of different names between England and its imperial rivals. And so it became expensive and complicated to ship rice. Rice is very bulky, had to be shipped in large barrels. The insurance rates went, sky high. And so in the 40s, Carolina planters were looking for another commercially viable crop that they could mass produce, that they could ship more efficiently than rice. Indigo was a very popular dye. It was, everybody in the 18th century wore blue, and various shades of blue. So the deepest purples were worn by elites, and faint gray was worn, it was used to dye the clothes of sailors and soldiers. The French mostly monopolized the indigo market. But Eliza was able to tap into a network through her father in the Caribbean to send indigo seeds, as well as a French man to help her cultivate indigo and really manufacture indigo. Growing of the plant is not that hard, but turning the leaves into a viable dye is a very complicated process. And so she partnered with several other low country planters, including Charles Pinckney, in these experiments. Over time, first with her son, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and then other Pinckney descendants, the story got told that Eliza Pinckney introduced indigo in South Carolina, that she really invented indigo production. And that's not true. But she was a central figure in, sort of a community effort to try and find an alternative to rice, to try and produce indigo dye that could compete with the French. And she did. And indigo quickly became the second most lucrative crop shipped out of South Carolina. It was a good companion to rice cultivation in several regards. And it was vital to South Carolina's economy through the Revolution.
Fascinating.
That was a long answer. The short answer is they want to get rich. That was a lifelong goal of hers, to get rich and stay rich.
Get rich and stay rich. I love that. And I see we have another question from Colby English. So would women of all classes be at the center of families and their finances, or just the upper classes? That's a good question.
Yeah, so, there's been some good research in the last decade or so about women beyond the elite class in the colonial Atlantic world. And I think the findings generally show that women are much more important financial players than we often understand. So, women might be partners with husbands who were printers or apothecaries. Women engaged in small manufacturing, like of hats and clothing. It's more in the record for upper class women. Like, I've got all kinds of evidence of, transactions that Eliza Lucas engaged in, correspondence with factors and attorneys in London, with overseers throughout the low country of South Carolina, with her father, trading goods in the Caribbean. So there's a lot more evidence for the upper class, but I think the evidence that we have is that, women are important financial players beyond the elite class. And then in terms of being at the center of families, I think for I've mostly been talking about white women, but white women are the minority of women in colonial America. If you think about the whole hemisphere, and certainly if you think about South Carolina, white women were the minority. Most Native American nations and tribes, and many lineage descended through women. They were matriarchal and matrifocal communities. And so, you were born into the house of your mother, and, women were the center of those families. And then because of laws that were passed by enslavers throughout British America, defining lineage for enslaved children or the children born to enslaved women. Legally, those became matrilineal communities as well. And children, of course, could be sold away from their families, could and were routinely sold away from their families. But there were also, approaches and relationships where a father might live in one community or on one plantation and the mother and children in the other. And so, the evidence that we have about the importance of women and the centrality of women to family and to family finances is, to my mind, pretty overwhelming.
Yeah. And that's interesting, the tie between the Native Americans and enslaved people. Yeah. Very interesting.
And that's true in Philadelphia, Sam, right? Like that's true of women in Philadelphia?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep. Okay, Cynthia Miller asks, hello, what was the relationship between Eliza Lucas Pinckney and each of her children? And she says, thank you.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. As I think I said earlier, that she was very committed to building a legacy for her family. She was very committed to the idea of and the wealth and prestige of the Pinckney family. When the French and Indian War was breaking out in the interior of North America, the Pinckney family was actually living outside of London in a village called Ripley. They had been there for some years. And Charles decided they needed to come back to South Carolina to protect their interest. And she and he went back and forth about when they would go, how long they would stay, and if they would bring the children with them. They decided to bring Harriet, the middle child, the only daughter, and leave the boys in London. Shortly after they got back to South Carolina, Charles died. And this begins the long story of Eliza as a mother to these three children. One who lived with her, Harriet, who was her daily companion for the next decade. The other two, the boys, remained in England and they came of age. And she did not see Thomas for, I think, 17 years. Wow. I think it was 12 years for Charles Cotesworth. So that doesn't contradict my point about her focus on the family. She was focused on the family's future, and she thought the best way she could take care of her children's future was by taking care of their property, their land, their investments, and the people they enslaved in South Carolina. That was more important than being with them physically. And so, the mothering she gave to the boys was very extensive, but it was conducted through letters that she sent across the Atlantic, mostly addressed to Charles, but to be read to his younger brother, Thomas, as well. She did succeed in fostering a very close bond with the three of them and with all four of them together. And they were a tight group for, as long as they lived. After Eliza died and her children all lived into old age, and they saw each other with great regularity. When her brothers were, in their middle age and later off conducting foreign affairs for the American Republic, Harriet Pinckney Oree took responsibility for their estates and for their children. And so that part of Eliza's work as a mother was very successful. But I think it's always shocking to people in the 21st century that she would leave behind a 7 or 8 year old and a 12 or 13 year old and not see one for over a decade and one for 17 years and still be able to be close to them and formative with them. There was one moment where the boys had portraits done and they shipped them across the Atlantic to their mother and their sister. and neither Eliza nor Harriet could recognize Thomas.
Oh.
So she didn't even know what he looked like. But she still shaped the man he became through these advisory letters. And he always wanted very, very much to please her. Maybe in the more so the absence, I'm not sure.
It's so interesting. And it's interesting to think about in the age that we've been living in, and with Zoom and FaceTime and everything, how different it is. If we are far apart, there's still so many ways to communicate. So it's fascinating to think of people being apart for that long. And yes, maybe getting a portrait or a miniature at some point along the way. But yeah, wow, 17 years. And I wonder if she was kind of thought about her own life and how it had been successful for her. Maybe she thought, okay, I want to do this for my children too. That since she had done her time abroad and became who she was. But
yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about that until this moment, Sam. But that's right. I mean, she did okay over there alone. Yeah. Thomas had an older brother, so he's in better shape than her. So. But also the letters, like she doesn't know if the letter's going to get there or not, and how long it's going to. And when she had to write them when their father died, she wrote the description of how he died and told them all about that. But she wasn't sure if she should send it or not, and she ultimately sent it to their like the surrogate parents for them and their schoolmasters. You'll have to decide when and if you want to share it with the boys. But can you imagine being 7 and your older brother reads you a letter that your father has died? And it's another world. It's another world. Yep, another world, and just a fascinating one. But we have another question. Elizabeth Hickey asks, given that England was the major importer of indigo from South Carolina, was Eliza a Tory or was she supportive of the revolution? Well, she became very supportive of the American Revolution. Charles Cotesworth and Thomas came home fierce defenders of colonial prerogatives, probably because they were in the imperial center when all the successive turmoil was unfolding over the Stamp Act crisis and the Townsend duties and so on and so forth. And also they were treated in natural, like what they were, country cousins from the periphery of the empire, but not true English gentlemen. And so they arrived back with, despite having not been in British North America for any of their, adolescence or young adulthood, they came back having finished university and the Inns of Court, fully supportive of the patriot cause. Eliza was from the outset worried about what it would mean for her family finances. She and Harriet anticipated the turmoil that it would unleash, although not the sort of physical turmoil that they would endure, but certainly the fiscal or financial turmoil. But she stood with her sons. Harriet's husband was also a patriot until the occupation of Charleston. And then he renounced his patriot leadership loyalties and reasserted, his allegiance to the crown, which put Harriet in a sticky position because her brothers are fighting literally on the front lines. Tom is seriously wounded in the Battle of Camden, and her husband's now turned Tory, and so he was sort of then pushed on the outside of the family circle. But Eliza remained fully supportive of the revolution. And then, once she and her children rebuilt their fortune on the other side, highly proud of being a member of the American Republic. And she was living with Harriet at her estate near the end of her life. But when Washington made his tour of the South, she and Harriet and Harriet's daughters welcomed him as his first stop in South Carolina. was at Harriet's estate. So she was, in the last decade or so of her life, a very proud American, but supportive of the revolution. I thought principally her sons were so supportive, and she would not have risk alienating them or becoming estranged from them.
Which that makes a lot of sense, that she would be so supportive of her children and their views and want to be with them. And yeah, very interesting. And we have another question. Would you tell us more about Eliza's life as a widow? How did that affect her ability to own property or attend to the family's financial affairs?
So that's another really important question. In Charles's will, he clearly wanted Eliza to be independent. She was the executor of the will. She was the guardian of the 3 minor children, beneficiary, and she had oversight because they were minor and she was in charge of them. She had the oversight of their part of his estate as well. So her control over the finances was so she didn't know to execute the will. There were some creditors that she had to pay off, but she said, "I have nobody to call me to account. I have nobody to call me to account." And so, she was, financially independent thanks to the will, and she managed with great success her part of the estate as well as her minor children's part of the estate. As they grew up, Harriet married. The two sons came home from England. They took over their inheritances, and she spoke about her life in a way very similar to the language that Jefferson and Washington used American Revolution before, came undone. She said, "I look forward to sitting under my own vine and fig tree." She was very proud and satisfied of what she had done with the family financial affairs. I just want to say again, all of it predicated on slave labor and the enslavement scores, and over the course of her life of people. But she was a very independent woman as a widow.
Fascinating. She was. And she just thinking about, being tasked with this large estate, settling the estate, and taking on being a mother all alone of these young children. It's just, what a life. And I do have one question about the role of enslaved people during the revolution for her. I know there was she was nervous about them fleeing to be with the British. So how did that kind of affect her life at that point? What was that as far as her inspiring her opinions about the American Revolution? Do you think that played a role in her being a patriot?
Well, the flight of enslaved people in South Carolina doesn't occur in a large scale way until the Southern campaigns of the Revolutionary War, until, the siege of Charleston, the occupation of Charleston, 1780 and 1781. And at that point, there are, when the British evacuated, the numbers range, but it was just thousands of formerly enslaved people who sought an exodus out of South Carolina to other parts of the Atlantic world to escape bondage in South Carolina. And this was deeply concerning to the enslaver, Eliza Lucas Pinckney. She was certainly worried throughout her life about the instability of, being a white enslaver in a Black majority. But I still think the main motivation for her in embracing the patriot cause was, I think she was influenced by her then grown sons. And I just want to double back to the question about her as a widow. She also never got married again, and that was by design. I mean, she was, I think, 42 when she was widowed. She certainly could have gotten married again. There were any number of prominent men in South Carolina who wanted to marry her, courted her, or, to court her, and she said, getting married again never once entered into my mind. And so the independence that she achieved as a widow, she was not willing to let go of. And, part of that is really loved Charles and thought he was irreplaceable. And the other part of it was, she liked what she did and she liked being independent. And she didn't want to have anybody to call her to account.
Yes, which I love that. I love that. Such a great line. And I know there's a couple of mentions of the suitors and how she's like, no, absolutely not for one of them. Yeah. But yeah, so great. We have another question. Okay. Kilter Chaos asks, was she a religious person?
Yes, she was a lifelong practicing Anglican. She attended church regularly in South Carolina. But she was sort of independent-minded in her religion as well. She crafted a personal set of prayers. If the minister said something she agreed with it. If she didn't mind disagreeing. She didn't go in for evangelicalism at all. She had a lot of harsh criticism for the evangelicals who came into South Carolina in the 1740s and 1750s, mostly because they were espousing anti-slavery views, but also because of the emotional expressiveness, I think, of evangelicalism. So she was quite a person of faith, again, within the Anglican tradition, but she was also an Enlightenment figure too. And so she always said, everything you hear about religion or everything you read in religious text, you must test against reason. And so she did that with her own faith. And again, that was another way in which she was independent.
And I think we have time for one final question. So this is a great question to end on. What surprised you the most while working on this book?
Oh my goodness, there were so many surprises. Okay, so here's just one example. So Thomas Pinckney was the minister to the court of St. James. He's the main ambassador to England in the 1790s in Washington's administration. And he was working with Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. And at one point he loses the cipher for, decoding these vital diplomatic materials. He has to write Thomas Jefferson and explain, I've lost this. I think I mailed it to someone else. It was horrible. It was completely out of character for Thomas Pinckney, who was a seasoned diplomat, a very serious person, and very committed to his work. I had known that story before I researched Eliza. I'd known he lost that the code. What I didn't know is he lost the code because he had heard from his brother, who was in South Carolina with their mother, that she had breast cancer. And they were trying to get her to go to Philadelphia to get treatment. But in the meantime, they had been told by a local doctor that they needed to apply leeches to her breast, and that would work on the cancer. But Charles Coatsworth explained they couldn't find the right kind of leeches in South Carolina. And so the ambassador to England is running around London looking for the right kind of leech to ship across the Atlantic to try and save his mother's life. And that's the moment that he loses that cipher. And so to me, like, that was a surprise, but it's also like how public and private intersect, and how if you don't pay attention to family and women, and that you can miss a crucial part of the story. If you didn't know that Eliza Pinckney was suffering from breast cancer and that her son was trying to find leeches for her, then you might think he's irresponsible to his political duties. But if you know the full story, which was a great surprise to me, then you realize he was a supremely dedicated son.
What a fascinating story, and what a fascinating thing to end this on. And Lorri, I am so happy that we got to sit down and talk today, and I can't wait until I can see you in person again. And I just want to say once again, check out her book and go online and order it. And and feel free to tune into our next event, the Martha Washington Lecture, coming up on June 23rd. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and for the great questions.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone, for the wonderful questions.